So we are on to British Harvestmen, one of my favourite subjects, in 3 parts. Today we'll start with the introduction, then we'll look at identification over the next 2 Thursdays in some detail. So, excuse me, here we go. So many of you have seen this before. Basically, if anyone doesn't know who I am, that's what I've done previously. The key thing for this evening is that I wrote the Guide to Harvestmen of the British Isles for the Field Studies Council. So this glorious fold-out chart, which I'm sure some of you have, and that's will be mentioned again later. In case, just to put in context this talk with the others, I think a lot of you that recognise a lot of your names who've been on the millipedes, centipedes and woodlice talks that I've done already, and they can be found on YouTube, and these 3 will also be up on YouTube subsequently. So anything that you, if I rush through things too quickly or you want to have another look, they'll be up on YouTube. So this evening, part 1, I say, is just an introduction, particularly perhaps for those people who've never looked at Harvestmen before, or people who've not even looked at invertebrates before. It's just a little introduction to what they are, why on earth you would like to consider looking at Harvestmen, a bit of information for finding more out, what are the keys and resources that are out there available to you, basic life history and ecology, a bit about collecting them and recording, and not really anything about identifying any of the species at all this evening. So next week we will be looking at the main characters in anatomy for identification of species, and look at the easy British species, the ones that, and they are pretty straightforward. And then part 3 will be looking at the slightly more difficult species, which might need a bit more attention to identify. But to be honest, they're not that difficult, really. Harvestmen are really very straightforward. So I'm just going to start out by just a rather random, if you like, sort of cultural reference, again, a little bit like we did with the woodlice. And there's a painting by Salvador Dali called Daddy Longlegs of the Evening, Hope. This is quite a well-known painting by Dali in 1940. And for copyright reasons, it's been somewhat obliterated. But if you want to have a look at it online, some of the links are on the screen there. But if you search "Daddy Longlegs of the Evening, Hope" by Salvador Dali, you'll see it in its full glory. But there in the centre is a Harvestman, or in the context of this, a Daddy Longlegs. I won't be calling them Daddy Longlegs very much, but for now we'll go with that. This painting, what it's about is it's reflecting on the Second World War, and in the corner down here is Cupid, and he's tormented about the violent changes that have taken place across Europe during the war. The ants, as often in a Dali painting, sort of represent decay and destruction. So that's the decay of Europe. There's this human figure that's just draped and wasting away, playing a sort of melting cello, I think, over here. But the key point is in the centre is this one Harvestman, and it's there because it acts as a French symbol of good luck and hope. And so with all of this bleak scenario of World War II, the Harvestman is there as a sign of good luck and hope. So if that's not enough to justify looking at harvestmen, you know, there we are. They're a symbol of hope and luck. So they're a good thing to be studying. So it's a really great painting, actually. So do have a look at that if you want to see it in more detail. But there we go. That's as far as I'm going to go with the diverting into the cultural side of things. But they are a fantastic beast. I love harvestmen. They are an arachnid. They're not spiders. And so we'll look at some of the characteristics that separate them from the spiders initially, and where they sit taxonomically. They are 8-legged, as the arachnids tend to be. And I'm specifically showing those pictures because, as with many creatures like this with long gangly legs, they tend to lose them. So the first identification character isn't always that they have 8 legs. This one's got 7 and this one's only got 4. But they can get around reasonably well with just 4 legs. There are all sorts of, on YouTube, you can see videos where people have removed various different types of legs, and the gait and the locomotion changes quite dramatically. Not, I mean, obviously as it would if you remove the legs or something, but they have a completely different pattern as they lose different kinds of legs. But anyway, it should have 8. So we're looking at, in theory, an 8-legged arachnid, but it's not going to be a spider for a number of reasons. If there are any people who should be watching this webinar who don't particularly like spiders, have been persuaded to watch, harvestmen are very different, really. I'm not convinced that there's a lot of similarity, because in all honesty, I'm not really that keen on spiders. I've got a slight arachnophobia, which is very hard to admit. And I was just saying, so I did a talk on harvestmen to the British Arachnological Society, which is a room of big fans of spiders. And yeah, I'm getting into them. You'll be pleased to hear, but I'm not really a big fan of large house spiders and the like. So if you don't like spiders, don't worry. Harvestmen, different creature entirely, really, in my mind. I'm quite happy to handle harvestmen. So enough of my psychological hang-ups. Taxonomically, they're an arthropod. They are an arachnid, along with the spiders, the mites, the scorpions and pseudoscorpions. And they sit within the order Opiliones, Opiliones, however we want to pronounce that. And in Britain, there are 3 suborders, which won't really concern you, and I'm not going to go into the details of these suborders and the taxonomy a great deal at this point. But for reference, there they are: the Dyspnoi, the Eupnoi, and the Laniatories. And the Laniatories is only recently, the Scotolemon genus has only very recently been found in Britain. So previously, we really only had representatives of the Dyspnoi and the Eupnoi. So there's the taxonomy. So in looking at how they differ from spiders initially, the key characteristic of a harvestman is this single fused body part. In a spider, you've got a constricted waist and a sort of forebody called a cephalothorax at the front, and then an abdomen at the back with this waist in the center. So 2 parts: an insect, head, thorax, abdomen. But with a harvestman, it's all one sort of globular mass, if you like. So you've just got this one cephalothorax and abdomen fused together into one mass. So if in doubt, if it's got a waist, that'll be a spider rather than a harvestman. Another obvious characteristic of a spider is that they spin silk, create webs. If you see a harvestman in a web, it's being eaten by a spider. It doesn't want to be there. So if it's in a web, it's not likely to be a harvestman. That's more likely to be a spider. So that you may occasionally find harvestmen as prey, which may throw you a little bit. But single body doesn't produce silk, harvestman. The other thing with harvestmen is a characteristic is that the second pair of legs is always longer than the others. So it's quite clear in those two images that they have this long, like antenna feeler kind of function, and it taps away. You usually see that it's quite clearly some kind of sensory organ that they're using the second pair of legs for helping them orientate themselves. The Japanese word, or a Japanese word which is sort of out of favor in some respects for harvestmen, actually it means blind man. So it's like a blind man tapping his white stick. And that's not really a socially acceptable term to use these days, apparently, but it quite clearly shows that tapping action that they use this second pair of legs for. But again, if in doubt, that second pair of legs, not to say other species of invertebrates don't have long second pair of legs, but harvestmen always do. Another characteristic which I think the first time I ever saw a harvestman and understood what it was, I was quite surprised. I'd not realized that they have this ocularium, this turret on the top of the body. So you've got this big central sort of body with this bulge on the top that carries the eyes, called an ocularium. And they just have two eyes, one on each side of this prominent turret, and sometimes you'll see it referred to as a turret, but generally speaking, in the keys and texts, it will be called an ocularium. Spiders would generally have 6 or 8 eyes, but harvestmen only have 2. So it's not always as prominent as this beautiful orange prominence here, this fantastic one on Scotilaemen with the 2 little eyes either side. There are other species where they're quite low and the eyes are sort of barely lifted up on an ocularium, but generally speaking, it's a good character to suggest you've got a harvestman, prominent turret with 2 eyes. A key behavioral and sort of biological characteristic difference between a harvestman, which really sets them apart from spiders, is that a spider, more often than not, will produce a little sperm packet and leave it somewhere and run away, and the female spider will come and take that, and there's all sorts of variations on a theme around that. But harvestmen are much more direct. They walk towards each other. The male has an intromittent organ, a penis, and they just walk straight towards each other and they just copulate, which is very different to the way spiders go about reproduction. And we'll talk a little bit more about it later on, but it really, you put 2 harvestmen in a tank together, and it can be as swift as that. They'll take one look at each other, encounter each other, and mate. And the penis is very distinctive, a really helpful way of identifying the species. But obviously, that takes dissection of a dead specimen. But behaviorally, a very different way of reproducing to the spiders. So we've used the word daddy longlegs already in the Dali painting. A lot of people refer to harvestmen as daddy longlegs. I prefer to just stick to harvestmen because harvestmen are harvestmen and nothing else, whereas there are several things which people will refer to as a daddy longlegs. Perhaps the most notable thing that perhaps you might confuse a harvestman with a spider is in the daddy longlegs or cobweb spider or cellar spider, Pholcus phalangioides, and one or two other species of spider which are not dissimilar. But they've got that long gangly leg appearance, but there is the waist between the cephalothorax and the abdomen, which sets them apart. The cobweb spider is usually in a fairly messy web of one sort or another, and other characteristics are quite different. But apart from anything else, this the Pholcus phalangioides waves around quite dramatically in its web as well. So quite a different animal. But really, if in doubt, and a lot of people do make the mistake, just look for really that waist between the abdomen and cephalothorax as a giveaway. And also, if you can see more closely, you'll see this has, I think, 6 eyes in Pholcus, rather than the 2 on a prominent little turret. Yes, the other, there are also crane flies, which we'll mention in a moment, which are also tend to be called daddy longlegs. Another key issue difference between harvestmen and spiders. Spiders are venomous, harvestmen are not. No harvestman is venomous. There's a lot of online myths out there. You find all sorts of things online about how daddy longlegs and harvestmen, depending on what people are calling them, have the most potent venom of any kind of creature, and their fangs, maybe you might find an article that says they're really poisonous, but they can't puncture your skin. Well, no, they can't puncture your skin, and they're not venomous anyway. They have no kind of venom. They have no fangs as such that for injecting that venom. The daddy longleg spider, the Pholcus species, they could potentially and can pierce human skin. They've got reasonable fangs on them, but the venom isn't strong enough to cause any problem to humans. So this soil harvestman at the top here, Anelasmacephalus, does a great little job. It's minute. It's a really small thing. It does a great imitation of a tarantula. They walk in quite a similar way, but it's well, you wouldn't be frightened of it. It's about 3 or 4 millimeters long, but it's not got the fangs that our friends down here, the bird-eating spiders and tarantulas, might have. So not venomous. I mentioned the crane flies. The other kind of daddy longlegs, I mean, to me, I refer to these as daddy longlegs. Crane flies have got wings that only got 6 legs, 3 pairs. And so I would probably refer to those as daddy longlegs, but I appreciate that around the world and around the country, there are lots of names, but I'm sticking with harvestmen for the creatures today. So we tend to think of harvestmen. I've been talking about these long gangly legs and the various similarities between daddy longleg spiders, and daddy longlegs clearly refers to something with long legs and a small body. It's not always the case with harvestmen, not necessarily typical of all of them, but many do have that small body and long legs. But again, this is that Anelasmacephalus that was just rearing up in the last image, and very small, but the relative length of leg to body is reasonably short. It's nothing like the gangly legs of other species. So again, tend to be gangly leg, but not all of them. So another name that you might hear in different parts of the world and in the past, certainly in Britain, is shepherd spider for a harvestman. And the order name Opiliones and Opilio, which is a genus of harvestmen. Opilio actually means shepherd or herder. And the reason that that name came about is because over the centuries in a number of countries, shepherds would walk around on stilts so that they could be above their flocks and count their sheep and see if any were missing. So to actually raise themselves above the flock, they would walk around on stilts. And I think that seems that is a very convincing reason why you might refer to these creatures as a shepherd spider. As you can see in that image, often the shepherds have got their two long stilts, but also a long extra arm as well, a third or fourth stick to support them. Very similar to the long-legged versions of harvestmen that we're referring to. So there are a number of images out there of shepherds through the ages showing this definite long gangly-legged appearance. So Opiliones, the order name, is because they look like shepherds, which if you look at the shepherds around here, you wouldn't understand why. Why harvestmen? Generally speaking, because a lot of the larger, more notable species are seen in the autumn. So around autumn, harvest time, late summer, often commonly encountered in sort of grassland, straw, wheat kind of habitats. And so people harvesting would probably encounter some of the larger species of harvestmen in that activity. So it makes reasonable sense because of the time of year. But also when they discard the leg, and they will readily discard a limb as an escape mechanism, the leg has a little sort of pacemaker built into it, so it will continue to twitch. So you get this scything action. So it's also suggested that perhaps the name comes about because of this scything action, as if they're using a scythe or a bill hook to cut wheat in the same way. And in fact, a French and a Welsh name for it actually means reaper. And I think there's also a German name for harvestman, which also refers to reaping. So this reaping action that the legs make, it's suggested that potentially that might be why they're also called harvestmen. But all these things kind of come together in the harvest time to combine to suggest why we might call them that. So that's generally the kind of how we would recognize a harvestman, very roughly. Why on earth look at harvestmen and say, I'm really quite fond of harvestmen for a whole host of reasons. So why would you want to? Well, I think they're just inherently fascinating. Just to look at them, they are quite amazing creatures, and their behavior is fascinating. Their appearance can be outrageous. Really quite fascinating structures of armature and spikes and patterns, and they're coloured, and they've got weapons and all sorts of things. So they're a fantastic creature. In mine, I believe that if they were larger and people actually could appreciate them, I think they'd be more popular than dinosaurs and sharks. There you are, I've put that out there. If they were this big, people would love harvestmen. I mean, they would have the same attraction and enthusiasm that kids do have for dinosaurs and sharks. I think it's just because no one knows, because they're so small. But hopefully I'm going to show you some pictures to give you that level of enthusiasm for a harvestman that you might reserve for Tyrannosaurus Rex. But so very kindly, some photographers around the world have allowed me to reproduce some of their imagery to show you just how fabulous harvestmen of the world can be. And there are around 7,000 species that are sort of considered as valid names for harvestmen. And I'm not going to linger on any of these particularly, but just take a look at these fantastic creatures. So these are some of Nicky Bay's pictures. Fantastic. It looks like it's been carved, and a jewel of a creature with a spine on the back. Just look at those mouth parts and these extendable baskets that it can send out to catch its prey. Enormous great spines on the back and interesting patterns on the front there. There's another of these big spines on the back, and that one's got a double spine, and also is probably camouflaged to look like a bird dropping. So fantastic creature. But I mean, look at this. There's fantastic mouth parts that extend out, and then it's got a basket with spikes at the end, like the Iron Maiden kind of enclosure with spikes on the inside to capture its prey. And if that wasn't enough, it's got a needle-like spine on the top of its head. So that's a fantastic picture by Nicky Bay. And there's the same thing extended outwards. So it's got these grasping weapons at the front to capture its prey. And if that wasn't enough, under UV light, they glow as well, certain species. So what might appear to be a little dull under UV light is a spectacular blue glowing creature at night. So some of Melvin Yeo's pictures, similar species, these huge mouth parts, great spine on its head, and these extendable catching baskets at the front. Perhaps a little simpler, bright orange, 2 spines on its back. And just look at the spines on that. If you're a small springtail or a woodlouse or whatever it's trying to catch, and you just get spiked within from all directions by these things. There's another one with a tremendously spiked palps at the front. Beautifully coloured, tremendous colours, and probably the ultimate in capturing spikes around the palps. That's a tremendous one. This is one of Art Anker's images, and you know, the spike has become a handle you can pick it up by. And this one's got the incredible sized mouth parts, the chelicerae, the biting mouth parts, with which it just tears away apart its prey. This one's also got a large expansion at the back legs. Beautifully coloured. These can catch things at the back as well. So it's got the front little developed front palps and mouth parts, but at the back end, it can catch things from behind. And just look at the colour of these things. Tremendous things. Tremendous colour. That one is just awesome. It's one of my very favourite harvestmen, wearing an ice hockey mask. His little eyes protruding on what is where the ocularium would be. Tremendous looking thing. I think that might be my favourite. It's got red lipstick and false eyelashes. This one's just quite a bizarre, beautiful harvestman. And multicoloured, beautiful finish to them. And what can I say? It's just a wonderful creature. And finally, I think Andreas Kay's bunny harvestman image, 2 spikes, and it is known as the bunny harvestman. So come on, they are pretty wonderful. But the British species are pretty amazing too. They vary in size. We have quite a range of sizes of from reasonably small, and this is actually quite a large harvestman. The one behind it is considerably larger. This is probably just about the smallest British species, Scotolim and Dorier, which is quite recently, 2007, that was discovered. And this is the second most recently discovered in Lancashire, and this is a really big long-limbed harvestman called Leobunum limbatum. So quite a range in size, and these short legs compared to these enormously long ones. So quite fantastic creatures. Very spiky, very armored, incredibly long pointed elements to them, spikes on the back and these powerful horns at the front. Great big death daggers in the palps and extra sticky additions to the palps and bumps and lumps all over and great patterns. Spikes on the back, beautiful shiny glossy surface on that. This is Scotileman again with more of these really deadly spines for catching prey, and this tremendous Ocularium with his little orange eyes. This is largely only seen in South Wales, but it's got these tremendous like boxing glove shaped palps here, and tremendous tridents or structures at the front of spikes of one sort or another. So quite varied and quite interesting, even in Britain. So there are actually only 33 species to worry about. So actually in the next 3 sessions, we will look at all 33 British species that are known currently, and hopefully you'll have a reasonable idea of how to identify all of them. So it's not often you can go on a course about invertebrates knowing that you can come away at the end knowing how to identify the entire British fauna. And not only are there not that many of them, but they're not just isolated in the south. So it's, quite often you think, oh, how many, perhaps up in the north, in the northwest, wherever we happen to be, you probably get a lot more diversity on the south coast or Wales or elsewhere. But actually, Sheffield's a really good place for harvestmen, not just because I'm able to spot them here, but actually in the north, we get a very good diversity of species too. So wherever you are, you can find a good range of them, and they're really quite easy. They're really not difficult things to identify. Probably 26 of the 33 are really pretty distinctive. I might go as far as to say you could almost identify them on one character, but that's assuming you vaguely recognize other general aspects of their form. But maybe 7 need a little bit more attention, but we'll look at those in the last week and tease out what the nitty-gritty is for recognizing one species over another. So, there we go, 26 very distinctive things, very easy to find. They're all over the place. Say easy to find, somehow slightly more difficult to find than others, but generally speaking, this is a lot of these are kind of invertebrates that sit on walls of your house. They're not hiding away necessarily. So relatively easy, and throughout the year. So you can find adults of one species or another at all times of the year. So wherever you happen to live, there is scope for you to become the local expert. They're not widely recorded. They're under-recorded to an extent, but hopefully after this, you'll be more equipped to do some recording in your local patch, and you could become the local recorder. So, why do we care? Well, they are a valuable and useful creature as part of the ecology. They're a significant predator. They feed on all sorts of basically invertebrates that are smaller than they are, but we'll again look at that a little bit later on. But they're also preyed on by quite a lot of other things as well. So they're a good food source for a number of other species. So a very valuable element of food chains and the ecology. They are quite under-recorded, so there are good opportunities to make very significant discoveries. And, let's be honest, that motivates us as entomologists and invertebratologists. There are many things to be found. There are new species to be found. There are new county records. And this is my garden. This is where I am right now. My garden is nothing special. Okay, I took it on a day when the plants were looking pretty, but lots of lawn, a few beds around the side and some pots and a patio. It's not a very big garden. It's pretty much all you can see there. You know, it's just the same as these gardens here. So I'm in Sheffield, so you know, Midlands to the north, and not a very significant. It's not like I do a lot of wildlife gardening. I've got a meadow along this side now, but so just in my back garden, and this is because I guess I know what I'm looking for, and I know what I've seen before and what I haven't. So fair enough, I have some knowledge, but you will have some knowledge at the end of this. So Opilio canistrinii, the red harvestman, the second British record, and it was known from the Lee Valley in Essex, one record, and then a couple of years later, I found in 2007, I found the second, third, fourth British record. I started looking around Sheffield, found a few more. So that's just in my back garden. While I was playing with my daughter, I saw a harvestman, thought, don't know what you are. Second British record, that'll do for me. And this is a species which is has a particular interest as well from an ecological perspective. I'm not going to go to a lot of detail, but basically it's walked from Italy. And as it's made its way from Italy across Europe, there are other large species of harvestmen which have declined to the point where it's almost replacing species that we had here previously, which we may not have been endemic, were certainly considered as a native to this country. And so there are now others which are becoming scarce because of the arrival of this. So an insignificant things that you can just find in your back garden. Platybonis Pineatorum. I went and had a look for one of these today. I couldn't find you one, but perhaps in the next 2 weeks I'll be able to bring one. But this was a new species for Britain. From my back garden, while I was cementing a wall, I noticed this little creature. I thought, again, I don't know what you are. So that was 2010. That was new to Britain. And I was just about to finish writing. This was just about to go to the printers, except for I needed one more photograph. I needed just one more species to capture, which was that picture. So it was almost ready to go to the printers, and lo and behold, found a new species. So fortunately, that is in here. That Platybonis Pineatorum is included in this because I found it with a few days to spare. But it keys out, for those of you who looked at Harvestmen before, it keys out at a thing called Rylina or Platybonis triangularis, but it has these white dagger-like spines, and it's a lot darker, and the Inocularium is a much wider structure and a slightly different colour, and it just looked different enough, but it would have keyed out as triangularis. But a bit of research showed that it was Platybonis Pineatorum. Both of these in my back garden. So this is then produced, and the aim of any good field guide is that you want people to put it out of date as soon as possible by recognizing new things that aren't included in it. And lo and behold, Trevor and Dilys Pendleton in Worksop found a bunch of large green harvestmen, and contacted me to say that they'd found this thing, which I knew what it would be because it's a thing called Leobunum species A, which had been cropping up in parts of Europe, Germany, and the Netherlands, and quite distinctive, quite large, very different colour to anything else in Britain. And so that was almost immediately found in Worksop. I then found it in Barnsley. It cropped up in my steg, and from 2006 I found it in at least 5-6 places across Sheffield, so it's quite widespread here now. Fulham, Winchester. This is now appearing all over the country. Where it came from, we're not sure. We have theories, which I won't go into today. But another new species, and this is all around Sheffield. So I'm doing very well. I'm having a great time. But since 2017, there are 5 other new British species that have cropped up around the country. And yeah, they're all very distinctive. I mean, you look at that and not one of those looks alike. So Dicronopalpus caudatus, Dicronopalpus larvatus, that the aforementioned Scotolemon dorii, and then Laburnum limbatum, this great big orange gangly legged thing. And last year, during lockdown, Hystricostoma argentea linealatum. And fantastic beasts, all since 2007, often by people who didn't really know much about harvestmen, but recognize it as something interesting. So thank you to the guys that brought these to our attention. But you know, 5 new species to Britain, that distinctive since 2007, means that there's going to be more out there that you can find. So that is a 22% increase in the British fauna in 10 years, which is astonishing. And there will be other species yet to appear. So there's never been a better time to look. These species are cropping up all the time. And there's a lot of information now to help you to recognize them. There's an online key. This is now out of print, and I am currently in the throes of rewriting it for the Field Studies Council. So there'll be a second edition of this out at some point. If you can still get a copy of this, some of the images will change, so it's possibly worth having both, but this is no longer available from the Field Studies Council as far as I'm aware. There's a lot of free online information. There's a Facebook group, which is where a lot of these new ones have been flagged up as people have put pictures online, and we've recognized them as something new and exciting. So the Facebook group is fantastic for highlighting the news. Meg Skinner has reinvigorated the recording scheme and is getting to grips with that. So it's a really good time to look at British harvestmen. I'm going to have a quick look through some of these resources for you at the outset, just to give you a sense of the kind of information that we can that's on offer to help. So there's, as I mentioned, there's the guide, there's the online identikit key, there's an online copy of a former version of the Linnaean key, there's the latest Hilliard synopsis of the British fauna, the Linnaean Societies, that's the 3rd edition. I think somewhere around here. Where are we? I'll worry you with that. Anyway, I've got the 1st edition. Considerable improvement on the 1st edition, and huge difference between the 1st and 3rd edition. But an excellent book with information about distributions and genitalia and all the information you need at the next level. So this is, if you've not seen it, this is the field guide for the Field Studies Council. Lots of images and a summary on the back of the key features for identification purposes. As I say, it's out of stock with the Field Studies Council, but I'm working on adding in the new 6 species that aren't in that. The idea of that was basically just to offer pictures, pretty pictures really, to go with the more specialist works that were out there. So hopefully it shows a male and a female of most species, comparison charts to recognize the beasts that you're looking at. It's really a beginner's guide, a sort of, hopefully it's a bit more than an I Spy guide, but it's, you know, you can recognize things by the picture because they are so distinctive in a lot of cases. But hopefully it's a support to the more specialist stuff, and hopefully it will encourage more recording. That's the Facebook group is UK Harvestmen. Do ask to join that. We'll let you in. It has to be joined by request. There's also the British Arachnological Society. There are pages about harvestmen on there, and there's the Spider and Harvestman Recording Scheme as part of the British Arachnological Society, and that's got a lot more detail, more up-to-date maps of distribution, some photographs of the creatures, and descriptions. And again, Meg is updating this now, and so this is as up to date as it's been for many a year, really. Though people have been very stoically working away at it, and there's a lot of information you can find on the BAS website anyway. So, and that's recommended to you. For the Field Studies Council, Rich Birkmar and myself wrote an identikit key. It was one of the first ones that Rich put together, and it's really a way of combining all the information that you can see and gather, and then it churns out an answer to you. So you go on to the identikit page at this web address, and you can look at what can you see about your creature. What do you recognize? Maybe you know what the trident looks like, the shape of the ocularium, the various characteristics of the body are listed here. What are the palps, the size of the legs, and things like that. And as you make a selection that you think best fits the description, then on the right-hand side here, it narrows down the species, and at the top, the one which is most likely to be the right answer sort of comes bubbling up at the top. So I've filled this in to say what kind of it's what length its body is it granular appearance, it's black with 2 pale spots, patches on as its dorsal markings, whatever information you can have, but it's already telling me that Nemostoma Immaculatum is my likeliest by a long way. And you can then click on that, it will take you to the knowledge base. There's a gallery of images, there's more information about its distribution in Britain, and a bit more about how to recognize it and where you might find it. So hope use that. That's free, that's online. It needs a little bit of an update because some new species and there are 1 or 2 spelling mistakes and things in there which we need to tweak. But generally speaking, that is available to you for nothing, to be able to help you track down which species you've got based on what you know. You haven't got to know all the detailed information. You've not got to work through a dichotomous key in the order that someone like me may have dictated you follow. You can look at what colour it is or how long its legs are and the things that you're most comfortable with, and hopefully that will start to give you an answer. You can look at some pictures and you'll be able to track down what it is you're looking at. You can compare, so you can compare 3 species if you're not quite sure which one you've got, and it's more than likely going to be those 3, and it will give you a summary of the information, and you can start comparing and contrasting and deciding which one's which. You can even look at various circle pack type systems, and as you enter the data, the circles gather together, not quite in a taxonomic order, but gather together in similarity until the larger option is perhaps the biggest circle. So a number of different ways you can use this. It's quite good fun. Go and have a play with some specimens. It's not foolproof, but it's useful to get you underway, and hopefully will give you some confidence. If you want more images, go to my Flickr site. I've got currently 550 photographs of harvestmen in that album. So there may be some pictures in there which just give you a bit more confidence about what you're looking at. And if you're getting more and more interested in it, internationally, there's some fantastic books. There's a lovely French book by Iorio and Delphos. Hay Wijnhoven's Key is superb, which is in Dutch. Fantastic illustrations. They're just lovely drawings of genitalia and various features, but this is a beautiful book. but the BAS produced an English translation. So there is an English translation of that if you buy the Dutch guide. And if you really want to go the full hog, there's the masterwork, absolute masterwork on Harvestmen, which is just beautiful. And it gives you every family described around the world and their life histories. So that's a beautiful book. So there we are, lots out there. If again you want more information, OmniPaper, that's an international, that's the place to find papers on Harvestmen, and the fandom wiki Piliones, there's a lot of information on there as well. So plenty of stuff for you to look at. So apart from being ecologically significant and an important predator and also a valuable prey item, and there are few to learn, and they're easy to identify, and there are loads of resources to help you, and they're easy to find, and they're available all year round, and they're under-recorded, so new discoveries are being made all the time. They're fantastic just to study and look at. Apart from that, what did Harvestmen ever do for us? Well, they're also harmless to humans. They eat garden and crop pests, so they're valuable in that respect. They're a good indicator of climate change, as they move around quite readily. Some of these things can cover some ground and will respond quite well to climate change. They can offer early warning to invasive species, partly because there are other associated species that perhaps are associated with them, but these Harvestmen tend to be quite noticed and quite noticeable, whereas a lot of other smaller things may sneak in under the radar. So it gives you a little clue to perhaps some invasive species routes, which other things you might not recognize. The conservation of these, again, because they're easily recognized, because they're perhaps large and readily identified, their conservation or the issues facing them, if they're dealt with, then other essential species can also end up being conserved. It's a bit like grey-crested newts. You look after a pond because it's got grey-crested newts. You have all sorts of associated species which are benefiting from the fact that you've paid attention to newts. So paying attention to Harvestmen can be also beneficial to other things. Whoops, let me go back. They're very good in captivity. They're not always easy. They're a predator, so predators, anything carnivorous in captivity can be a problem. But they have such a wide diet that actually they're quite good in captivity. They mate quite readily, and so they're very good for all sorts of research into all sorts of cytogenetic and ecological studies. They've barely changed. They're sort of pretty evolutionarily speaking, they're quite stable. They haven't changed much for just 305 million years apparently, and so that actually they've been studied quite extensively in sort of ancient historic biogeographical studies and looking at evolution as well. So a valuable beast. If that wasn't enough, you can also find cattle with them, which, I mean, what more do you want? What is he talking about, you ask yourselves? If you pick up a Harvestman by all 7 of its legs, the one that's left will point to where the cow has wandered. Okay, that may be an ancient old wives' tale, which I can't verify, but nonetheless, hey, it could come in useful. Bear it in mind. Hold the legs. The one that's pointing, that's where the cow is. Okay, useful creatures. What did they ever do for us? So I'm going to sort of coming into land a little bit now. We're just looking at their life history, how they actually get about and reproduce, the sort of nitty-gritty of their lives, if you like. They're basically a ground invertebrate, so they're living in the ground layer, leaf litter and the like. You'll find them under logs and rocks, and you'll sweep them from shrubs and bushes at different points and different heights. But also they're often seen just sitting on walls and fences and tree trunks. So they're quite in your face. Quite a lot of the species will you almost can't miss them. Toilet blocks always seem to, there was a species in Scotland, and one of the first records I heard of was somebody saw it on a toilet block up in Sutherland somewhere. And I don't think there were many other structures around for it to be sitting on. So you do see these things just quite in your face. So pretty easy to find by looking in these kinds of habitats. They have a varied, I mentioned that they have a very varied diet. They are predominantly predatory, but they are really an omnivore, and they have a whole host of things that they will feed on, and certainly in captivity it makes them a little bit easier. But because they are predatory, they've got a number of sort of obvious key predatory features which might be very obvious that you look at it, looking at something which is a hunter or something which is certainly chasing down prey. So they've got prominent eyes, they've got reasonable eyesight, but they can't see images as such, but they're very good at detecting movement and light and dark. So they're not really something which has got excellent eyesight by any means. But the position of them is possibly in a better, more of a defensive functional position, a bit like a bittern, in that it can probably see front and back. The only place often that they can't see is just behind and just in front. But nonetheless, clearly prominent eyes. They also have these very obvious specialized feeding structures called pedipalps. So they're almost like the 10th pair of legs, if you like, at the front here. And they're above the biting mouth parts, which we'll look at in a moment. But the pedipalps are really the things for capturing prey, manipulating it, and taking it to the feeding mouth parts, the ones that are actually going to chew it up. So pedipalps are very, occasionally people will just talk about palps, but we're referring to them as pedipalps. So these structures here with their various spines and features, and likewise these structures here with various different, almost like sticky lollipops on there for sticking prey to, or these spines for literally piercing prey. So quite a different array of structures on the pedipalps. The pedipalps take the food. So here's the pedipalps. They then direct that to these biting pincer-like mouth parts, the chelicerae, however you want to go pronouncing that. But these are, as you can see, pincers, like mini claws, effectively the claws that you might see on a crab or something like that, but they're small, tucked underneath the head. You rarely see these, it's just underneath. And the pedipalps take the food to this point, and they are just torn apart, and the mouth parts are just behind there for it to digest its dinner. I mentioned the second pair of legs acting as antennae, and they are very important. They've got a number of functions for finding its way around. If a harvestman loses both its second pair of legs, it doesn't fare well. But if it's got down to four legs, if it's lost 4 legs, as long as one of them is still that second pair of legs, then it can still function reasonably well, though it's on its last legs. Apologies. But they don't live for a lot longer once they get down to 4. It has been shown they can still survive on 3, but really their days are numbered. But the second pair of legs, really important sense organs. So they're preying on small soft-bodied invertebrates, anything that's a little bit smaller than they are. Springtails, flies, anything they come across. They'll eat worms. I often, in captivity, if I've got nothing else, I'll get a small snail or a slug and kill that, and they will just pick at that. They'll quite happily feed on dead material. But if you can provide them with lots of springtails and flies and things, they are reasonably happy. But they'll eat dead things, they'll eat bird droppings, they'll eat fungus, and they'll eat decomposing matter of one sort or another. There are a number. Some are fussier than others, and they have very specific feeding methods. And if you're something that relies on a palp that's got sticky glue for catching springtails, it may not be the sort of harvestman that might take well to a bit of fungus in captivity. But certain species, certainly the ones that can pick away at decomposing material, will feed on all sorts of things. So quite an omnivorous beast. In captivity, I'll tend to feed some of the larger things on ham. They quite like ham. It's a reason we'll just put a bit of ham in there if I don't feel like killing slugs and snails, which is often the case. But if you've got something like a Trogulus tricarinatus, feeds virtually exclusively on snails from the shell. So if you're trying to keep those in captivity, you need snails to find Trogulus. So where you find Trogulus may be much more dictated by it being a suitable environment for snails than necessarily anything to do with the requirements for the harvestman. But yeah, you can see this. If someone's kindly sent me a harvestman in the post and I take it out of a pot and it's a little bit dazed and I give it a bit of ham, more often than not, they're straight on it and quite happy to chew on best quality Wiltshire cured ham. Often with the larger species, they may act as ambush hunters. So you've got a creature which is suspended like on a tripod up in the air, effectively, and it will just drop down and capture species from above that they knew nothing about. A creature will walk along, not realizing it's walked between the legs of a very large harvestman, and the harvestman will just drop down and capture anything that walks between its legs. Some of the smaller species may just rely on things bumping into them. There's various stories about whether all harvestmen are actually very active hunters at all, and quite a lot of evidence of them just waiting for things to come along and stumbling into them. So quite a range of techniques, but an ambush hunter serves quite well as a way to describe how they function. They're not usually far from moist habitats. Their body fluids are very dilute, and so for various osmoregulatory reasons, they need to be kept moist. They need to drink. They are very intolerant of water loss. So the first thing I would do if I took something that had arrived in the post to me from someone is I would give it water before I would give it ham. They're very, very, it's a great requirement. If you're sending anything in the post, they do want some moisture in there. They don't want to be swilling around in wet, but they do need to be able to drink. If they get dehydrated, they will need to drink. That's one that had literally just arrived in the post from Scotland for me, and so there it is, having a drink of a drop of water. In the wild, if they need to drink and there's nothing else available, they quite happily suck juice from fruit and chew on leaves to get some moisture. Their tracheal system, oxygen is just sort of absorbed in at any point through their sort of tubes that run through their body. And that's also where a lot of the water loss takes place. They've got no spiracles to close up to stop water loss. So they're breathing, but they're also losing water like crazy. And so it's really important to them to be in a damp environment. Again, because of these osmotic reasons, the water isn't actually something that they acquire from food. So it's not like you give them a nice juicy slug or something. You think that they'll get sufficient moisture and water into their system by eating something like that. They still need to drink. So what they feed on is not really, it's more about just what food they need, and whether they can break down the cuticle and whether they can break apart the prey item, rather than if something is full of water. That's not what their prey items. They're not looking for a drink. They're looking for food. Another feature of a number of species of harvestmen is this thing about aggregations, and the ones Laburnum species A, when it cropped up in Worksop, it was spotted quite clearly because it was in an aggregation, and they will be in bunches of hundreds sometimes, but not many British species do it. So the Laburnum species A, it can't entirely be recognized by this behavior, but there aren't many others that do it. Some of the other laburnums do, but not commonly. Laburnum species A will be in a massive 40, 50 sometimes. And it's suggested that this kind of gregarious behavior, it's in some insects, it's known to reduce water loss. So it may be that by the increase of humidity around all those legs actually helps them to remain at a slightly higher level of humidity, and it perhaps dew might form, and so it's actually just a damper sort of place for them. But all sorts of reasons for gregarious aggregation behavior in invertebrates. It's not been shown that it particularly saves energy, but it almost certainly also has a defensive benefit, in the same way that a shoal of fish, someone might get eaten, but it might not be you. So that kind of strategy. But they're very impressive or terrifying, depending on your perspective, when you see these masses of very large harvestmen. So that mass there that you can see, that photograph on this image, is about this size. If we can work out the scope, about my head size. And so they're tucked away in little corners, but yeah, they're all sitting there, all these little bodies along the bottom, and all these massive. It's been described sometimes in where they're huge amounts. It's like a mat of horsehair with these little bodies underneath. But this is a hole in a brick, and there were several all tucked inside there in all sorts of directions, an absolute maze of legs. Sometimes called the green bobber, that Laburnum species A, coined by Mike Davidson, I think. But this is a small aggregation in Sheffield, and hopefully the video will play and show you what happens when I come and disturb them. I don't disturb them usually, but for this, there you go, and off they go, and they bob, and I guess that action is probably quite startling to a predator that's looked at this nice mass that it was approaching, and then suddenly this whole mass disperses and starts bobbing around. So I think that's probably quite a useful defense strategy if you're a harvestman. Most British species mature in the autumn, the majority do, but not necessarily, and some will mate all around the year at different times. Some, it might be that they just mate in August or something, but others can reproduce throughout the year. And they'll lay their eggs, just little spherical white things like that, in damp soil or moist vegetation. The female has a long ovipositor, and she'll probably tuck them somewhere reasonably safe, but they don't go to a lot of trouble to hide them. But she does have the means to bury things a little bit. So inevitably, certain species at one time or another during the year, there'll be a dormant phase, and it's often the egg, but sometimes it can be a young that's hatched and will overwinter as a sort of nymphal immature stage. And that, depending on the species, they could be laying at any time, and may hatch 2 weeks later, or it may be that they are overwintering as this dormant phase to hatch again in the spring. So generally speaking, I won't labour this, but there are sort of 3 main life history patterns in Britain. So they can be active all year round with various overlapping generations, and so there'll be adults at any time. So a lot of small things that live in leaf litter, there could be adults at any time, and they're all overlapping in their generations. There are some which are more annual that overwinter as a newly hatched nymph. They hide, and then they mature, and then lay eggs, and then they hatch again in the autumn to overwinter as a little juvenile. Or there are the ones which are the more obvious sort of annual species, where they hatch in the spring from an egg, they mate, they lay some eggs, and then they die. And again, the egg next spring hatches and some more emerge. So 3 sort of patterns. That can vary depending on the location. And so an example of Nemostoma Immaculata, this black one with little white dots, they can be adult all year round in Durham, so fairly well north, but they can be adult all year round. And they may overwinter as either an egg or as an adult. But in Western Scotland, still considerably further north, I guess, they may only be adults at certain times of the year. So depending on where you're watching from, I could say, oh yes, Nemostoma Immaculata, they're adult all the time, but they're not, depending on where you live, and probably progressively further north, they're probably overwintering more as eggs than adults, and having that dormant phase in the harsher times of the year. Also, the same occurs with altitude. So if you're in lowlands, you may find that these things are adult all year round, but at the top of a mountain, they've got these same issues where perhaps there's more of a dormant phase, and they're not trotting around in the snow and ice. So same things happen north-south or altitudinally. When it comes to reproducing and they've hatched and they're ready to mate, there are a number of interesting behavioural patterns, which I can't go into a great deal of detail, but they don't have a great, they're not very good at sensing airborne chemicals. Harvestmen, the legs, the primary sort of sensory organs, are not very good at chemorecepting things that are flying around in the atmosphere. Really, a female largely only knows a male has arrived when he touches her. So they're very tactile, and when something touches those legs, then very quickly they understand what's going on, and they may very quickly mate. But there isn't any sense of, I can sniff out the males or the females over there. They're hunting around until they bump into each other in a lot of cases. Not true absolutely of every species in the world, but it tends to be that they're not the most aware of animals, and and it is quite funny, really, the way that it's like, you know, if they walk past each other, they may never know that they were there. Ships that literally passed in the night and they never met. When they do meet, and they, as I say, they might just, oh, right, male, female, because we don't meet very often, they mate maybe quite readily. The male, once he's found his female, may guard her. So if you see some of these long-limbed Laburnum species, you might see this kind of behavior. I mean, both of them are showing it, but much clearer on the right-hand side here, and Laburnum gracile. The female will perhaps sit with her body on the ground, and the male much more in that sort of arched, you know, high up ambush kind of position. But he's protecting her, he's guarding her. He says, she's mine, and he will fight. They will fight other males off to protect his rights to this female that's down there. So you might see, if you're not quite sure the difference between a male and a female, you might just find that she's at the bottom and he's at the top, and that's quite a good indicator. And even in those aggregations, you can see that sometimes the males are at the top, females are more at the bottom. Once the males perhaps, maybe they've mated and he's guarding her to protect her from mating with other males, when she goes off and lays her eggs, he may well follow her, and he may well be hanging on to her. It may be the end of the legs is quite prehensile, there's a lot of segments, and so he may well be grasping her and follow along. Not in all species, but it's a behaviour which is interesting to see. So he's guarding her and hanging on, holding hands with her, and protecting her, and it's a benefit to her. She's also being protected from other things, I guess, by having a male there. But all the fighting goes on up there while she's sort of sitting down there and ignoring everything. There are some parthenogenetic species, so there are 1 or 2 species which in this country we've only found females. Platybonis Pineatorum, which is the one that I found for the first time in Britain in my garden, and we've only found females in Britain so far, but males do occur. They will produce males under certain circumstances, and it's a very distinctive all black thing. But so far no one's recorded one of those in Britain. So nearly there now. So in order to, once the eggs hatched, the young quite quickly shed their skin. They just hang upside down and step out of the skin, as a lot of invertebrates do. They'd probably do that 7 or 8 times, maybe every 10 days, depending on when they get larger, depending on how much they're eating, how big they're growing. But yeah, they'll just step out. So you sometimes find these sort of empty husks of harvestmen around, which are just where they've stepped out. Most species live for about a year. Perhaps the male dies first. Once they've mated, his job's done, and so you may see females a little bit more, bit later than the females. But once she's laid her eggs, she'll die too. In captivity, they'll last a bit longer. There's no natural predators, and the conditions are usually better. I've kept a species which would normally die in perhaps December. I've kept them till May, sometimes, just by keep feeding them, and they're reasonably happy. Defenses are great. Just looking at some of the armament, they have all sorts of protection, spines on the ocularium to protect them from things feeding on them, but also this species, Megabunus diadema, it's very well camouflaged among mosses and lichens. I've not got many pictures of them in mosses and lichens because actually you barely see them in the photographs, so that one you can at least see. So they can be really quite well camouflaged. Platybonis Pineatorum, I mentioned, tends to, when it's younger, be in leaf litter, and it's very hard to see indeed. Other defense mechanisms, some of them feign death, thanatosis as it's known. So a couple of species, Analesmocephalus and again, the name's escaping me, Doriae, Scotolemon. they curl up and they look dead, and they don't move for quite a while. But again, we've also seen that bobbing and aggregation as a defense as well. So a range of different ways of defending themselves. A key thing with harvestmen is they have these stink glands, and these can be quite obvious at the front of the cephalothorax, and these odoriferous glands produce noxious smells, and you will see them sort of washing themselves with it, spreading it over their body. Some people say they can smell harvestmen. I'm not one of those people that said I can recognize, but sometimes because they put this stuff over themselves, and it does have an odor which certainly repels things like ants. But another character sort of feature of their legs, which is a very obvious thing in harvestmen, is that they shed their legs. If you grab them by the leg, they will walk off and leave the leg behind. And that's a very deliberate policy. And they actually have a mechanism that you can sort of see in that image there. And they actually, at the trochanter, this first little limb, so between the coxa and the trochanter, there's a weak point. So there's a very deliberate weak point. So if you pull the leg, it will break there rather than somewhere else. And the reason they want it to break there is because behind that weak point, there's a shutter system which will close off to stop them losing body fluids. And as we know, they're very fussy about losing water. So they don't want to lose any body fluid. So they want, if you're going to pull a leg off, they don't want body fluids going everywhere. So if you were to break the leg halfway or at a knee joint or somewhere else, that mechanism isn't there. So there's a weak line there. The crazy thing of this is that weak point also occurs on the second pair of legs. So you've basically got one of your most important sensory organs is designed to snap off under pressure. So it's like having eyes that under too much stress will pop out of your head and be lost. So I guess the balance here is that being caught by something, it's better to run away and leave one of your second pair of legs behind than to worry, than to actually have it so it doesn't pull away and the whole body gets eaten. But fascinating, this structure is there deliberately so that it will break off. Geologically speaking, with a lot of insects and invertebrates tend to think that they're tied to certain types of geology. There's not that much relationship between geology and harvestmen. To an extent, Trogulus tends to be in chalky areas and limestone areas, but that's possibly because they're feeding on snails and there are more snails in those kind of areas, rather than it needing the calcium for its exoskeleton, which is common to all harvestmen. So it doesn't seem to be that key. I think Megabunus, the spiky crowned one, people tend to think a little bit that it tends to be more in limestone areas. It's certainly around here in the Peak District. We tend to think of it as something on limestone, dry stone walls, but actually I find it in gritstone, perhaps not as often, but it's on gritstone walls in the Dark Peak as well as in the White Peak. So not hugely tied to geology. So if you're looking for them, you know what habitats they like, you know the kind of food they're looking for and their need for moisture. So you're looking under stones, logs and rocks, and best to look at night because it's more moist, the atmosphere is damper, so they're more active at night. They're harder to catch because they're trotting around rather than just sitting still. They're not fussy about the cold, so if you're looking for them, they could be that you will find them at quite high up in Snowdon and then Ben Nevis. It's not that you won't find harvestmen at high altitude. They are very tolerant of the cold, and a number of species can be found in December and through to January, and there are a number of winter. Some of the new species are very much February, March species. So you find them just looking by hand, the hand searching, sweeping both high and low. You'll get different species at the top of shrubbery as well as low down in the herbs, beating things off branches into a tray. Sieving will get you some of the more difficult things in leaf litter. Pitfall trapping, a lot of they'll fall into pitfall traps, but don't. If you're really specifically looking for harvestmen, if you put shrew covers over, then you won't get shrews falling into your trap, but neither will you get a long-limbed harvestman. So you tend not to get the big harvestmen falling into pitfalls. I mean, some of the really big ones will just step over the pitfall trap anyway, and certainly be able to get out. But if there's a liquid in the bottom, then that prevents that. But the price you'll pay is you might catch shrews as well. Tolgren funnels, this thing where you have a funnel and a light above it, and the small beasts will fall down through into a collecting vessel at the bottom as they avoid the heat and light. Some of the tiny species and the difficult species in leaf litter can be extracted that way. Best way, stare at walls. When I walk around in the autumn, I'm just always, whoever I'm with, they're kind of used now that I make no eye contact because I'm staring at walls all the time, because some of these big things, these big harvestmen, the interesting new species, they just sit on walls and they're really quite obvious to find. So yeah, start staring at walls and being antisocial. Do some gardening. This is my drive. Weeding my drive, I find 4 species of harvestmen down there, probably all sorts of different. So always have a little pot with you, as if you're weeding. You should obviously say don't weed the drive, but there are those in the household that want the weeds removing from the drive. So, but you will find a lot of harvestmen there, just underneath sort of geraniums and shrubs and sort of rockery plants, just lifting up these kind of things. That's where the harvestmen are. They're sitting under there if they're not sitting on the walls. Cut your hedge. That's how I found Platybonis Pineatorum year on year, and Opilia canistrinii. They're up in privet. So when you're cutting privet, look at the trimmings, shake your trimmings, and these things trot away. So do some gardening. Just pick them up, let them walk into a pot. They're very, you stick a pot in front of them, they usually walk into it. A biggish pot if it's a biggish creature, and then just put a lid on. That's all you need to do to catch them. Or you can just pick them up. Just get all your fingers above the creature's legs and just pick up all its legs as best you can. You need to pick up at least 2, or it will release its leg. It will break off. So you need at least 2 legs so that there isn't the traction for it to pull away. And of course, if you've got one like this and you catch it by the majority of its legs, you can, of course, find some cattle. So that's always important, isn't it? But yeah, always ensure that you've got more than 1 leg, even 2 or 3, ideally. So that's it really for this week. We'll look next week at a bit more. I should say, obviously, we want people to, once we've learned to identify them in the next couple of weeks, do some recording. I'm sure you're all familiar with the methods and why we want to record. We would recommend using iRecord or your local arachnological recorder. Visit the Spider Recording Scheme website. There's information there too about how to record. And when the new guide comes out, there'll be a bit of more information on there and some links how to record. So when you find something, what's the species? Where did you find it? When did you find it? Who saw it? And pass that information on to someone else. That's, I know we've heard this before, but it always bears repeating. So iRecord is a good way of doing that. Harvestmen are really good things to photograph, and a lot of them can be recognized within reason by a photograph. I don't like to say that they all can, but if you're sending an record in, I suspect that Meg would be able to, 90% of them, if they're supported by a photograph, she could probably confirm. So do add a photograph if possible. Go online, use the app, take a picture and enter your records. And then you've got all your data that you can retrieve. So that was us this evening. Next week, we'll be looking at the main characters and anatomy that help you identify them. And then we will look at the easier species to recognize. And then I think the third week, we'll look at the details. So that was an introduction to Harvestmen. And then here they go. So there's a nice range of them. So to whet your appetite for what you might be learning to identify in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you so much, Paul. That's been a really excellent introduction and excellent part one of the three. I mean, you covered a huge amount of ground there, and I suppose I'm most enjoying just being that, you know, we're able to have time so you really be able to go into detail on natural history and showing amazing species from around the world, and really giving an excellent overview of you know going into things like all the resources that are available, how they're linked to ancient wives' tales and things like that. It's really nice to be able to have the time to do that. And yeah, I'm looking forward to part 2 and part 3. And yeah, there's quite a few questions been coming in as you've been talking, so I guess we'll get started with those straight away. So we had first question from Charlotte was, I read somewhere they eat bird poo. Is that right?
Yes. Yep, they will eat bird droppings. I don't know whether it's certain types of bird dropping. I haven't only read that they eat bird droppings. So it may be that it's the sort of bird droppings that has perhaps invertebrate remnants in there, or it may be that there's certainly levels of calcium in there that might be beneficial to them, and sort of nitrogen and all sorts of things, which, you know, there's a lot of stuff in bird poo which I can see is going to be beneficial. But yeah, they definitely do. But it's not something I've ever picked up as a thing to feed a captive one with, I must say. But you know, why not? Maybe, yeah, could do. But yeah, very omnivorous.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Next question then is from Elaine Wright of Subrek. Can you explain what granular means? It often stumps me in the key.
In the context of the keys that we are likely to be encountering, it just means a very bumpy, rough surface. The majority of them are quite smooth with Harvestmen, and granular, I don't know if you can remember, I could go back to it, but we'll look at it. It will crop up next week when we look at Hystricostoma argenteoluniulatum. It's a fantastic name that has. It has a very sort of granular, bumpy surface to its back. Trogulus tricarinatus it's described in the key as granular, and it's just a rough. It's almost I don't know. It's like it's micro pebbly or sandy. It's like little granules. Granular. It's little. If you threw sugar over a work surface, granular. Is that the easiest way of describing it? Granulated sugar over a work surface. That's a granular surface.
Okay, and is there a bit of a spectrum with it with the Harvestmen? So would you be able to say, yep, that's definitely granular, and that's clearly not?
Yeah, I would say in the context of harvestmen, it's probably not an issue. I can't think of any species out of all 33 in Britain where the difference between being granular or not granular is not going to be overcome by the fact that it's got huge horns at the front or black and white spots or something like that. The difference between Anelasmacephalus and Trogulus is possibly where it crops up, but there are other characteristics that would probably, it's a good example actually of how that identikit works, because there will be a thing that said, has it got a granular surface, and you'll be scratching your head over it and thinking, oh, I'm not sure it's granular or not. But actually, if you go to the one that's at the bottom character that was on my example, and it says that the overall body is black with 2 white spots, it doesn't matter about any other character in that key at all. And what I want to do next week, and the purpose of the way I wrote the fold-out guide, is if you found something which is black with 2 white spots, you don't look anywhere else. That's it. That said, next week I will also throw in some just some confusion on that, but generally speaking, they are mostly so straightforward that 1 character, 2 characters in combination will tell you. You won't need to go down the route of granular, I hope. But I think a lot of this comes about if you're using the identikit. I know a lot of people, I've encountered this at workshops, and people are working through each of the sections as you would, the body, each of those questions, the chelicerae, each of those questions. And then it becomes more complicated, which is not our aim with that. The aim with that is to say, let's just look at 1 or 2 gross features and narrow it down. And I know that, unfortunately, it has gone down the route of people getting overly complicated. Instead of a dichotomous key where you've got 2 choices, we're offering you 100 different characters to choose from, and you don't know which one's the significant one. I should say at this point, potentially, I'm in discussion with the Field Studies Council that potentially I might write an aid gap key. And I will try and write a key that states the obvious for a lot of these species right at the outset. We'll look next week about things like whether the terminal claw on the palps have got teeth on and things like that, and whether that's significant. But yeah, I'll write you a key that emphasizes at stage 1 what the really obvious things are. How's that? There's a promise.
There you go, Elaine. You'll have a new key to deal with there. Brilliant. Okay, I'll go on to the next question then. This is from Imogen. Do some species resort to cannibalism, or would they eat smaller harvestmen?
Yeah. Yes, they do. They'll eat each other. I had
Of the same species?
I'm not sure whether they would of the same species entirely. I've not seen them do that in captivity. Usually, examples of cannibalism are usually observed in captivity more easily. As I've answered before about woodlice, I think, if they're under some stress, if there's nothing else to eat, then all sorts of species will turn to eating each other. And their offspring. Certainly that would happen. But when circumstances are reasonable, they've got, food supplies not too tight, it's not their first choice to eat another of the same species. There's not a lot of value in that. I'm not even sure if males, when they're fighting, if they cause enough harm to actually kill one another, I suspect they would then eat each other. But they're not designed to kill each other, particularly in that respect. But they definitely will eat smaller individuals of any invertebrate. You know, if something strays into their path and they catch it, they'll give it a go, I think. So again, it's that question of cannibalism crops up, but it's not what they're about. But why not if it's a food source and you're under pressure? But they will feed on juveniles if they stray towards them, and that could be their own young, and it could be young of another species. You can say I've not seen it happen, so I can't hand on heart tell you.
Okay. Next question. Sort of, somebody then gave looks like a very good answer afterwards. So perhaps I'll say this question and say then what the answer was given, and then you might like to add or comment on that. Cool.
Yeah,
okay.
give them that answer.
So okay. So the question was from Keith Elder. You said that harvestmen had not changed much as a group in 305 million years. When did they split from the spiders? And then Sergio Henriquez said, harvestmen last shared a common ancestor with spiders around 541 million years ago. They are closely related to the extinct arachnid order Phalangiotarbida. That won't be the right pronunciation. In extant arachnids, scorpions that also have pincer-like chelicerae are their closer relatives, but all of this is always under revision.
Yes, I'll go with what Sergio said. Good answer. Thank you. And you know more than I do. Thank you, Sergio. That was an excellent answer.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. It was great to hear from you.
Good to see you. You in Argentina?
No, I'm in London actually. I meant to go to the US, but I'm in London now.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you for answering that, because I couldn't have answered that as well as you did.
Thanks very much, Sergio.
A pleasure.
Okay, well, with that then, I'll go to the next question. This one from Steve Lee. When photographing, is it important to get the whole leg spread in, or is it best to just concentrate on the body? Are we thinking about from a sort of recording point of view to get the evidence for having the characters that are relevant to the identification? I'm not sure.
Sounds like it. Body. Yeah, 100%. Get the body in. It's nice to have one image to show the sort of size, the relative length of the legs. But you know, one of the front, so you can see whether there's a trident, whether you can see the palps, and whether they've got apophyses on the palps. You can see the shape of the ocularium. So one from the front, nice if you can get around that. If you've got that time to do that. But otherwise, as with most invertebrates, it's nice if you've got one of the from above. So you've got like the saddle pattern and the general color of the thing, and any spines that might be around the edges of the cephalothorax. So one from above, one from the sides, always good. There are a number of species where you're looking at spots under the coccyx and things like that. And if you've got a side-on picture and you can just see those dots underneath the coccyx, there are 3 species that's really helpful for. And likewise, you'll see the various spines and what have you on the side of the palps from the side. So ideally, if you're going to, you know, for identification, one above, one from the side, one from the face on, and then, yeah, one of the overall. But the least important is the one with the legs. But there are characters of like some of the femur, the how angular the femur is and things like that can be really helpful, but they're not necessarily the #1 character that you're looking for. So perhaps some of those other characters. So yeah, always more, and the better quality, the better. The thing I always say to people, I've done courses on macro photography, and I think one of the great failings when people, I'm back, when you take a photograph, I hadn't even, this is not deliberate, but I was just about to take a mock photograph with my camera, but you'll see that there's a Laerbunum species A on the back of my camera, just to show how obsessed I am. But people will sort of just say, oh, right, there it is, and take a picture without, you know, there's a focal length here, which is quite important. You know, you go too close in, that thing is going to be out of focus. So go to the point at which it's in focus, then zoom it and tap it and refocus. You know, with a just pointing and pressing a camera phone, if you just make a little bit more effort, you can get really good pictures. But getting in too close, they will be out of focus. You know, the iPhone will not focus on you from here, but it will from about here. But then you can zoom again, tap, focus, you know, and then take your pictures. And of course, with a camera like that, you can then lay it on its side in front of the beast, even if you can't, or put it against the wall and you get a face-on image. But yeah, just the way you play with a phone camera, you can actually get really good pictures, but people often just think you've only that one shot, and it's not true. I've just, while I'm here, because it's sitting here, I know Hugh was asking about what camera I use, and this is just always sitting here. So I'm using a Canon 70D with the classic 65mm MPE 65mm macro lens, which will only take macro. And on this, it's currently got 3 extension tubes, and we'll take a pretty decent photograph with all of that. And a couple of twin flash with diffusers on, flash nappies, as I refer to them. And most of the pictures you saw were taken with this. I would recommend, if anybody wants to buy that kind of gear, don't go for one of the light, lower end models of the body, because the balance of a lens and flash of that size, you actually want quite a heavy body to balance. Otherwise, you know, a feeble little camera body with all of that on the end, I don't like. I like a hefty body on it. But anyway, there we are. That's the camera. So there you are, Hugh. That's what I use.
Thank you, Paul. Lots of helpful tips there, and well, with your presentations, you really show what that camera can do. Presumably, if you're taking with that one, but yeah, fantastic stuff you get with the harvest. Some of the harvestmen are pretty rapid, aren't they? I mean, they fall onto my beating tray a lot, and they're very quick away. So would you sometimes, you know, if you're in the garden and you want to get a photo of one, would you put them in the fridge like some people would do with moths, and just to slow them down a bit to get the shots of different angles?
I mean, obviously, a lot of them are sitting still when you find them, but if they're disturbed or if they're crawling up out of a sweep net at you, knock them back down and have another go with if they're in a sweep net. They are really manageable creatures. I mean, they are really easy. They're not so fast. It's not a spider. It's not a centipede. There aren't many that will outrun you. In a moth trap, if you find them when you're moth trapping or you've got a sheet, they're much quicker at night. It's much more difficult at night because they're much more active. But in the daytime, if you've swept them from undergrowth, yeah, you just grab them. They're reasonably robust. Grab them by the legs if possible, you know, a bunch of legs, but get them into a pot, knock them in. But yeah, I put them in a fridge. I take pretty much all my harvestmen alive to record, because I always want to photograph them before I've got any specimens, just in case. Because I've got a lot of things that I've photographed and that turned out to be something interesting. So I almost always take them alive. put them in the fridge. My top tip, if you've got them in a pot and you keep them in the fridge, and you know you're faffing about and they're warming up, so they are getting quicker, is if you've got one of these silver wine chillers that you take out of your freezer and put over your bottle of white wine, if you take one of those out of the freezer and you've got that next to you, as your creature starts to get a bit lively, back in its pot, put it back in, just put it into a wine chiller. Don't leave it in there for very long. I mean, like seconds. Give it 10 or 20 seconds, and that will stop it. That will stop it running around. If you leave it in there for much longer than that, it kills it. Even though they're very tolerant of the cold, those wine chillers are very intensely cold. And but they warm up quite quickly. But if you've taken it straight out of deep freeze and you pop any kind of invertebrate in there, it slows them down very quickly. But it will kill them very quickly as well. So there you are. So you don't have to keep popping them back in the fridge, which takes a while to cool them down, but you can just keep putting them back into the... And of course, it's handy if you've got wine.
Yeah, just an excuse to have the wine cooler out there.
Yeah, if we need an excuse, yeah.
So okay, move on to a question from Ian Bedison. I think this is more trying to remember a record. Says, I think Glyn Napton found a male P. Pineatorum last year.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. That's just
where was that?
A comment, really.
Okay. No, Pineatorum, someone posted on the Facebook group yesterday, that might have been the day before, that they found Pineatorum in County Antrim. And I can't remember whether it's been found on the island of Ireland or not before. There might be one record. So I'm not sure if there is, I'm not sure whether that was Antrim. But yeah, I've not looked at Facebook since to see if I've had any more comments back on that. But it was in Sheffield, it's cropped up here and there, but it's not, I think it's in Glasgow, Edinburgh. So it's starting to appear around and about. Still no male though. And male is just black with reddish black legs. But no one's seen one yet. So I haven't got a photograph of one. There's one in the guide. The only picture in my FSC guide that I didn't take was a German guy let me use a photograph of a male Platybonis Pineatorum. So I can't say that it's in all my own work, that field guide.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Maybe I'll give another chance. Anyone would like to speak a question?
Yeah, I sort of had a question that I made, but I think it's useful perhaps to have a discussion rather than just a blunt monologue where I put the question out, which is regarding the National Red List of UK Harvestmen. As you know, there is the National Red List for spiders, which was fairly recently done. And I was wondering if there is plans to do one for harvestmen, or if it does exist, where is it?
I don't know of a plan to create one for harvestmen. I think one of the problems we've got is the things that are scarce in Britain are usually an introduction. Therefore, they don't count as a British red species. So it's not, it won't be in a red data book. I wonder if Paralygolophus medii may be very, I mean, it's hardly ever found, and I don't think its distribution is known at all. And it used to be almost considered endemic to Britain because it was the only place, but I think there are records from the Pyrenees potentially as well. But as you know, we get things from the Pyrenees. There's no saying that it didn't come from Britain to the Pyrenees, who knows? But there aren't many, I don't think, which we can hand on heart say are our specialities. anything which is unusual, is perhaps a speciality for us, perhaps the subspecies of Mytopus moreo, ericaeus, something like that. You know, that we don't really consider that to be, you know, convincing that it's a species in any way. So I think the reason that perhaps, I say I don't know if there's anybody's discussed it within the arachnological world, but I can't see that there are that many that would remotely get close to being so important in Britain that they need to be protected. But I think Paralygolophus medii strikes me as the number one choice if we do. I'd love to do some research on that.
Yeah, well, I think that in terms of red listing, that there is perhaps the idea that only endangered species or very narrow species should be red listed, but there is value as well to record density, population declines, and even animals that are invasive. That's in fact an added value because they present a threat to the native species. And sometimes having a record, of course there's records, and you have very good records in the UK of what animals were invasive and when Leobunum A or B were first seen, and so on. There's fairly good record compared to the rest of the world, as you would imagine. However, I would argue, because this is what I do, conservation is my work. I am the chair of the spider and scorpion specialist group at IUCN. I would advocate, or the group would advocate, for red listing any species, regardless of how threatened it is, because we don't want to just red list threatened species. We want to red list all the species and use that as an understanding of which ones are declining or not, are perhaps invasive or dangerous to native species or not. So I was surprised that that effort hasn't been made for harvestmen when it clearly has for spiders.
I mean, I would agree for a lot. I mean, I find it interesting that it's been utterly overlooked that Leobunum species A arrived, and no one seemed to care. When and Apiliocanistrinii, when that arrived, no one seemed to like. I informed the people that I could inform about it when I found these things, but you know, to me, that's really important to know that something like Canistrinii, which has been wiping out Opilio peritinus across Europe, we should know it's arrived. If only we should decide, are we going to wipe it out? Are we therefore going to try and kill it off because it's arrived and we know it's a hazardous thing? Or are we going to observe much more closely because it's going to have all sorts of impact? So I tend to agree in terms of it doesn't have to be endemic and valuable here. But I would sort of not argue the case, but while we are, you know, Britain records species very well, the harvestmen records are still quite patchy, and it's still full of recorder bias, and it's still based on, you know, outdated information, so things are wrong, and there aren't many specimens. You know, I've tried looking and there aren't specimens to go back historically to check these things with. So I don't think the data is as good as it might seem. So I couldn't tell you. I could tell you that Canistrinii was here one day and now it's everywhere. I can tell you that, you know, subsequent to my field guide coming out, people have recorded more accurately Rylina triangularis or Platybonis triangularis. And those things are becoming more accurate. But I think we've only got 10 years of decent sort of comparable data, to be honest. But
I would agree. I think Odiellos is also invasive. Odiellos spinosus, right? It's very old. It has been recorded for a long time, but maybe not native? Possibly
not. I mean, it's certainly, yeah, Odiellos is something which crops up suddenly when it wasn't there before. And it's not, you wouldn't overlook it, I don't think. I think if we knew, it would be recorded. It's in my garden now, and it never used to be. It literally arrived one morning on a milk bottle on our doorstep. Don't think the milkman brought it, but it was literally on a milk bottle outside my doorstep, which was novel. But yes, Odiellos, yeah, that's expanding all over the place, but there weren't enough records, because not even the spider recorders, they weren't recording, not everyone was recording harvestmen, and the literature wasn't necessarily what it is now. So yeah, there's decent data, but I'm not sure. I've not looked into all of that in much detail. But I think be great. Let's red list them all.
I would vote for that. Yeah.
Let's do that. That'd be great.
I was just going to say, just in terms of Natural England have over the past decade or so, they've commissioned a lot of reviews of various taxonomic groups. Of course, the spiders in 2017 were I think that was funded by Natural Resources Wales. But I mean, I would like to think that that Natural England and perhaps other countryside agencies in the United Kingdom will try and cover every group because they're using the IUCN guidelines to give a threat status, as well as giving an updated GB rarity status. And with the spiders, let's say example, we as a project, as a Tanyptera project, we've been using those reviews and the threatened species that come out of those new reviews to actually prioritize commissioning surveys to better understand their distribution in our area. So they're very useful to us. I mean, they are the main source of prioritizing what species we should be trying to find out more about in our area, certainly. So I would hope that Natural England or Natural Resources Wales will commission a Harvestmen review at some point if they're not already planning to do so.
Yeah, I'm not aware of it, but it's not the field I'm sort of working in. So it may be that Meg might have been approached to do something like that to expand on the spider work. I'm not sure.
Yeah, one of the projects I think might be useful and relate more perhaps to Paul's work on recording and having more recording data is the Darwin Tree of Life project at the Natural History Museum that wants to sequence the full genome of all harvestmen in the UK. And we have been asked, and I've talked to Meg as well and other colleagues to try and get, and I would ask people attending this webinar now, that if you have collected specimens, that you should return them to the wild. But if you believe you would like to contribute to the project, especially with species we don't find often in London, because mostly of what I got is Odiolus or Canestrini, because I'm collecting just mostly around my flat because I can't go anywhere. If you do find species which are less common, those would be great because we just can't sequence them otherwise. And if we could, in theory, in the future, we could collect soil and we would find harvestman DNA in the soil, and we know they are there without even looking at a single or killing a single specimen.
Grant Brown has sequenced a lot of them. Well, he's had a lot of my material, but he's no longer able to do that. So I don't know what Grant was doing. Have you been able to access any of the material that he's not been able to do?
I was in touch with him, and I know that he hasn't replied at St. Andrews University, right?
Yeah, he's in Slovenia now, or Slovakia.
Yes, so those samples, perhaps, as far as I know, they were sequenced for chromosomes, so very small snippets of DNA.
Okay.
And what we were hoping to do, well, what the project is aimed to do, is the full genome sequence. So whatever bit of harvestman gets left in the field, whatever bit of skin or DNA, chances are it will be collected, and it would actually increase records a lot, I think.
Yeah. Well, I was just offering Grant the leg of a Paralegalopus medii, and he's declined it. So if you want the leg of a Paralegalopus medii, I've got one.
Yeah, we can surely talk about the material we can get, but if the other people here would like to get in touch with the Natural History Museum or with myself or with Paul, I'll be happy to share my contact. And if you have specimens that you could send, or that you'd be comfortable, of course, sending, we could create a list, because we don't want to, of course, kill animals we already have, but some species we just can't have access because we can't go everywhere, especially with COVID. So
the Facebook group's a very good place too.
Yeah, I've reached out there as well for a bit.
Yeah, seen that. So yes.
Okay.
That'd be great.
Well, thank you very much, Sergio. And I don't know, you might want to put your contact details in the chat or something like that. Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, thank you. We'll that's a really interesting topic. And yeah, let's hope they do something for a review on Harvestmen soon in the UK. Okay, so we'll move on to it's a comment really from Richard Gallen, and I would like to know actually myself. Red blobs on the legs are often reported by beginners. Is it worth mentioning what these are?
What the red blobs are. Yeah, I had I've got some pictures of red blobs on Harvestmen, and I just decided not to discuss it, not to mention it in my talk, just because I don't know much about mites, but they're mites. So the little red, very often stuck in the back of the ocularium of a species, you'll find that there are mites which are feeding on the sort of body fluids or whatever of a harvestman. I think from my understanding is that I don't think there's any kind of beneficial two-way process going on here. I think the harvestmen don't like it, full stop. I think it's always slightly to their detriment, but they can't get to that bit. So more often than not, they're at the back. You got this little red mite that's feeding on the back of the ocularium. But something like Mitopus moreo, which is the male's Mitopus moreo, is quite a black and white thing. So all these little red mites all over it are usually fairly noticeable. More often than not, Mitopus seems to just really attract mites. But I don't. There's a lot of information out there about the types, and in Pinto de Roca and Giribet, the big book, there's all sorts of information there about parasites and the species which are feeding on harvestmen. But I chose not to discuss it because I don't know much about it. But they're mites, and they're not beneficial.
Yeah, they stand out really, don't they? They're very bright, vivid.
Yeah, I can drop a picture in next week, possibly, we'll see, but it just sort of sent us down. It was going to send us down an avenue that I didn't know so much about, so I avoided putting red spotted harvestmen in. But they are fellow arachnids.
Okay, great. I'll move on to a question from Steve McWilliam. Paul, I understand that in Europe there is more than one species of Nemostoma. Have further species been separated or found in the UK as of yet?
No, but in 2 weeks' time, I'll go into it in some detail. Yeah, it used to be, in all the old literature, it was always called Nemostoma lugubri. It wasn't. The species in Britain is Nemostoma bimaculatum, but I actually found an individual about a week ago, 2 weeks ago, and I was convinced it was potentially a different one, and it wasn't. I dissected it, and it was bimaculatum. But lugubri has the actual lugubri, the strictly lugubri, which occurs in Europe, could easily be in Britain. Dentigerum could easily be in Britain. There are paranemostomas. There are all sorts. But so there are potentially 3 or 4 that could be around, and we need to keep an eye out. So far, though, all the evidence says as are bimaculatum. It was fantastic last year that Dave Holland found Hystricostoma, which to all intents and purposes looks like Nemostoma because it's black with 2 white spots, but it's got 2 white spots at the back end as well, and spines on its back. So, but it looked, it makes you think people with less familiarity could easily have overlooked Hystricostoma elsewhere. But definitely, I always take male Nemostomas, and I always say to anybody, it's not hard to tell the difference between a male and a female, and I always take males because the difference in penis between Lugubri and Bimaculatum is so distinct. It's ridiculously distinctive. So far only Bimaculatum, absolutely confirmed. People keep threatening that there's Lugubri out there, but I've not seen any evidence of it, and I don't believe there's any recorded yet. But please take all male Bimaculatums. It's common enough to afford to lose 1 or 2 specimens to dissection for us to find out there might be something, really interesting there.
Okay, thank you. And another question from Steve. Is O. castrinii widespread now?
Yeah.
It seems to be fairly frequent in the Merseyside area.
Yeah, it's pretty much really covered some ground. I was just in the gold edition of Arachnology. There's maps, and it's pretty widespread. I don't know if it's, yeah, there we go. So we've got 2010 and 2009 here. So if you could see the little dots, but it's considerably more widespread, these 2 pictures here. So it's this map. So it's in well, it looks like Dorset, Kent, Aberdeen, Stranraer, Norwich, Bangor. What else have we got there? Llandrindod Wells. I don't know. It's everywhere. But it really is quite widespread, and it's, when I first found it here, we thought, right, we need to look out for this thing, and we started to sweep high up. That was the thing. We were sweeping in privet and hazel and sort of exotic shrubs in towns, but sort of, yeah, hazel and privet just seemed to be really good, but high up. And it's a big, these long-limbed harvestmen tend to be higher up and moving across at higher levels than the shorter limbed ones. And so yeah, it's like Dicranopalpus ramosus. When it was first found on the south coast, the tip back then was start sweeping high up, at which point we started to realize it was working its way northward. And yeah, I sometimes think I need to hire a cherry picker and go, I really would like to know what's right at the top of the canopy in terms of harvestmen, because there are things up there that are not down here. But Canistrinii is, I have an extending pole on my sweep net, and that's where I started finding it all over Rotherham and Sheffield and Barnsley, and yeah, it's one of these technique things, but now I think it is genuinely more widespread. It's not just a recording technique thing. It has spread. We've seen it spread from Italy. I think it's in Sweden now, and I think when it first appeared here, I think might have been, can't remember, I spoke to someone in Denmark, and I think he was saying that it had just arrived and was replacing, I think in the Dutch guide, I think the suggestion is that it's replaced Opilia peritinus. So I mean, they are very similar sort of size. They look like they're a very similar niche, but it just seems to be better at doing whatever it does. Well, it may even feed on them. I was a question earlier, I didn't finish the answer properly. We talked about cannibalism. When I first found that, I put it in a tank with some Dicranopalpus ramosus, because I just had a tank with some of those in at the time. So I put my Canistrinii in there, and before long, I only had Canistrinii in there. So, I didn't have to find much food. It was happy to eat other harvestmen.
Right. Richard Gallen has just commented that Castrinii likes living in bristly plants like Echium pineana.
Okay. I'd be honest, I don't sweep that, so I don't know. And prickly plants, I've often wondered, when I was sweeping the hazel and privet, I used to look sort of longingly at hawthorn and assumed it's probably in hawthorn, which were in the same hedgerow, but I wasn't going to waste my sweep net on hawthorn. And I did try beating as an alternative, but it wasn't that successful, but there weren't so many around at that time. So yeah, okay, in the Echium, and interesting. Again, it's that thing, they've not been around for that long. Not that many people are really recording them. So actually all the niceties of these things and where we're finding them, we don't really know. We're still very much dots on maps, with not a lot of ecological information associated with them. So we probably ought to record a bit more than we do.
So thinking of, you mentioned, you know, about the more arboreal nature maybe of some, is there anything in Europe that maybe likes the high canopy that could be here? Right.
There'll be other Leobunum species. There will be other Opilio species. There are plenty of them. I mean, there are lots of Leobunum and other Opilios. So yeah, almost certainly there could be other things that are lurking, that have been introduced and are lurking higher up. It's a nuisance when we find another Leobunum, they're a bit of a pain, you know. The Nelemas as well, they're not easy to identify. Oh, the ones we found here have been blindingly obvious, thankfully. But even in Scotland, Gracilli, which we thought was first rupestri, which we then thought was Tischii, which we now definitely call what I just said. But it was quite a debate as to which one it was, Gracilli, because it's quite subtle. And initially that was even thought to be a Nelema of some sort, because they're quite a closely related bunch of things. And there's a paper, I think there are papers about not just trying to find out what Leobunum species A is, but I think the Spanish, the Iberian Peninsula, there's a paper recently about trying to resolve what the Leobunum species are there. So it's not like there's another one or two of them out there. There are quite a few. So yes, there could be other things. As it stands, we're calling them a green bobber and a blue bobber, and leave it at that. There's now an orange bobber as well, Limbatum, which is definitely a lovely orange bobber. But you know, this big, you know, it's just fabulous. Normally, the thing that is slightly unfortunate, doing the talk at this time of year and not doing it in person means that there aren't many big harvestmen around in Britain at the moment, and you're not here for me to show you things. When we generally do a course in the autumn, you know, I can bring along Leobunum species A. You know, I can always find one in Sheffield, and you know, we can have these great big things to play with, and we can find a whole array of species. It's so easy when you realise these things are this big and these things are that big.
Tony Hunter, our assistant creator in entomology, has brought in that species A before, and it is, yeah, I was very impressed with the size of the thing.
It's fantastic. Wait till you see Limbatum. It's not much bigger, but it's a good size. But you know, one of them's bright green and one of them's bright orange. You know, they're so easy, harvestmen.
Excellent. Okay, on to next question here. Mark Fordyce. is there any known benefit for Opilions to fluoresce?
I don't know, to be honest. I just know that it's some of the tropical species do glow, very well in UV light. The value of that, I don't know if there's actually much in the way of glowing in the dark. I've never encountered any of those species, so I can't actually answer the question. Other I could make some rubbish up about fluorescing centipedes and apply it to harvestmen, but I won't, because I don't really know much about it. I would like to see some tropical harvestmen, especially ones that glow in the dark. So sorry, don't know.
Okay, great. Am I saying that right? Opilions, or are they Opiliones, or how do you?
I tend to say Opilione, but I don't like Opilion. That's not. I don't like that pronunciation. Opilion's no good, but Opilione. I've heard people quote. Some people say Opilion, some people say Opiliones. I tend to say Opiliones, but
okay.
no good reason for that. Opilion doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll finish it there. Thank you so much, Paul. It's been a really good discussion and question and answer session, as well as the talk. So yeah, I've really enjoyed this evening, and I'm looking forward to next week, and I'm sure everybody else is too.